The year I was born, there was 1,500 murders in New York. I mean, the buildings were dilapidated. That pastor said some terrible things to me. Central to my story is the 7 times I almost died. I said to my mom, I said, who's Joe Rivera? That's your father. I went 55 miles an hour, maybe 60 miles an hour straight into a tree. I could jump. I'll probably break both my legs, but I don't know if I'll be able to ride out. I'll probably live if I jump right now. What's crazy though is he had me in his hands the whole time. But you don't realize this stuff when you're in it. My name's Anthony, and I'm gonna be sharing my story today. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1977. And I grew up in Brooklyn in the 80s.
It got a little longer, so it seems. I burned out, so to speak.
The year I was born, there was 1,500 murders in New York. And there's no doubt it was a dark place. I mean, I saw a video recently of what New York looked like in 1977, the summer of Sam, when Sam Berkowitz was committing murders in New York at that time. And I saw a news footage of what New York looked like in that time. And I could only tell you that, I mean, the buildings were dilapidated. It looked like some place that was war-torn. I remember asking my mother, why would you have a kid in that environment? And it just completely shocked me. I grew up a church kid, and my family would go to church on Sundays, go to Bible study on Tuesday, go to small group on Friday, or fellowship, whatever you want to call it. So I quite literally grew up in church. So for the most part, in my early years, I was really sheltered. You know, I didn't know much. I didn't have street smarts. I was book smart, but had no inkling of how the world worked. I was, just very naive. My parents really kept me in. I wasn't allowed out of the house. I was very sheltered. My father was always an elder at the church. At one time he was a pastor. My mother was a teacher, and she was also the worship leader at our church. So I literally grew up in church. So my parents really had me in this religious bubble. I wouldn't even call it religion. It was a godly house. It wasn't a religious house, but they had me in that bubble. And as I moved into public school and in middle school, I really started to be exposed to more of the urban culture, kids that socioeconomically weren't where I was at, and I just got exposed to a lot of other things. I started to hang out with kids that were, into hip hop and rap music, and hung out on the train and did graffiti and kind of got into fights and stuff like that. But I wasn't one of those kids. I was kind of like their mascot. I was a small kid. I was sheltered. I was naive. I was younger than they were, so I was just kind of a hanger around. I really didn't get into trouble. I was just kind of exposed to that world, and I think it was eye-opening to me. I found it exhilarating. It was different. It was exciting. It was, there was a whole other world out there that I hadn't been exposed to. And I think when I went from a private school and a small world into a bigger pond, so to speak, I think at that point, my eyes were opened, and there was something about that lifestyle, about the world, about rap music, about the urban culture, about that wildness, that running around wild out there, that just appealed to me. But still, all in all, still a naive kid, happy kid. There was no malice. There was no no darkness. I was a child of the light. I was raised in the church. I always knew right from wrong. And even though those things kind of appealed to me, there was no question about it. There was a line that I would not cross. Like, I flirted with the danger zone, that line, but I never crossed it. But I remember when a seed of anger was planted in my heart, and I will never forget it. We lived in an apartment building, but there was a basement to the building where my parents had kept stuff down there, and I was digging through and I found something with my father's name on it, turned out to be my biological father. But at that time, I thought my stepfather was my dad. You know, you grow up with your stepfather around from when you really remember, which is about 3 years old. And at this point, I was probably 11 or 12. And when I asked my mom, I said, I found this, it was a pocket watch with this guy's name on it. And I asked my mom, I said, who is Joe Rivera? And at the time, my last name was Ramos, which was my stepfather's last name. And I said to my mom, I said, who's Joe Rivera? And she said, that's your father. And I remember it going in slow motion at that point. After that point, once I realized that my stepfather wasn't my father, she never badmouthed my biological father. She didn't have any malice in her heart, and there was no ill intent when she said this. But at that moment, in a panic, kind of, not realizing, I said to her, where is he? Who is he? Why isn't he here? Why don't I know him? And I think out of panic, she just said, well, he didn't want anything to do with you. When your father leaves you, you feel like, what did I do wrong? What was I not enough for this person? What didn't I do? I think there's seeds of doubt that are planted in a kid's mind when his father leaves him. So that seed of anger really, and that wound really took shape on that day, and I'll never forget that. Right before high school, my family moved to the borough of New York called Staten Island. It's known as Shaolin. It was a higher income area. My parents felt comfortable with letting me out. And I think that's when I really got my first taste of freedom. It was more of worldly pursuits, I just wanted to have fun. I kind of wanted to explore the world. I wanted to, I started to like girls, like hip hop music and stuff like that. But I still wasn't trouble. There was still that line that I wouldn't cross. And my family started going to a church in Staten Island. And my father was no longer a pastor. My mother was no longer the worship leader. And they were just kind of in the congregation there. And I started to dress more urban as we had moved into a place that was more suburban. And I remember most of the people in that neighborhood, in that area, were white. And that pastor, not to say it was racially motivated, I think it was a cultural divide, because my style was more urban and we went to a place that was more suburban. But that pastor said some terrible things to me. He would tell me, you're trouble, you're a bad kid. He would whisper things to me at the door of the church when we would walk in on a Sunday. And I will never forget this. And I remember that seed that had been planted, that seed of anger that really had been planted when I realized my biological father had left me. That seed that was planted, that guy began to water with those words. That experience for me really tainted Christianity, Christians in general. I had a bad taste in my mouth at that point of who Christians were. I used to bring kids to their youth group, and I used to fill up my mother's van with kids from my neighborhood, and I always hung out with the kids who were a little, the kids who were trouble, because that's kind of who I had began to gravitate to. And they would say, what are you doing bringing these kids to church? And I'm like, what are you talking about? The Bible tells us to be fishers of men. You know, the Bible tells us, Jesus said, it's the sick who need a doctor. You don't think these kids are church kids? You don't think these kids are righteous kids? Then, you know, show them who God is. You know, what do you want? You want me to get what? More church kids to come to your church? What's the point of that? Who are we reaching? And what's funny is at that point, I wasn't, I was still just a child, but I knew enough of the message of Christ to know that those are the people that we should be seeking. And it's so funny to me that these people who were supposed to be doing the Lord's work were so willing to cast these kids aside and didn't want to reach the lost. Like, that to me is something that is, I won't say unforgivable. I will say that they will have to answer for it, though. There's no doubt in my mind that one day they will have to answer to God for what they did to those kids and to me. There's no doubt about it. And I was about 16 or 17 years old when my father said to me, you know, you don't have to go to church anymore. You're a grown person. And, you know, the Bible says, choose whom you shall serve. And my father said to me, you need to choose who you are going to serve. And I said, I don't want anything to do with those people at church. And I said, if I don't have to go, I'm not going. And I was like, I'm out.